what became more important was that with this little message, you're opening up the world of the secret government, which otherwise hardly appears to the superficial observer. Angel is next implies the top secret code name or code word for the presidential aircraft Air Force One. I go into intelligence agency reports. Now, let me just make a parenthesis. 9/11 didn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a world in which there are others watching. Who's watching? Well, Russia's watching, Israel is watching very much, the French are watching, lots of others, Germans, Japan. What I found is three separate reports. One is the Réseau Voltaire, which is obviously benefiting from leaks from French intelligence. The Réseau Voltaire version, which came out September 20th, 25th, says that the Angel's next phone call came complete with top secret code words across a variety of agencies, suggesting that the people who were behind the attacks were a powerful faction inside the U.S. intelligence community and government in general. And that secondly, they had the nuclear launch codes in their possession. That this report goes on to say that the Bush team thought during most of the day that they were the target of a military coup. And it was only somehow later in the day that the situation was recomposed. Now, what would it mean? It essentially means that the invisible government force behind 9/11 tells Bush that he must respond by stating that it's bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the Arabs, the Islamic world, and that what's going to happen is the invasion of Afghanistan and the beginning of the war of civilizations that Samuel Huntington writes about. In other words, an open-ended aggression of the United States against the Arab and Islamic world. The implication seems to be, in the Réseau Voltaire report, that if Bush doesn't do this, that this group is capable of starting that same war using not conventional forces, but nuclear missiles. In other words, simply ordering the launch of missiles towards, well, Afghanistan perhaps, but maybe Baghdad, maybe Damascus, maybe Tehran, maybe Cairo, maybe Islamabad, maybe Rabat, Tunisia, Kuala Lumpur, you name it. Any place in the Arab or Islamic world that would then start the war of civilizations with a vengeance. The DEBCA is an internet service that generally reflects the views of the Israeli Mossad. And they are even more emphatic that this telephone call came complete with multiple code words indicating that the invisible government force behind the attack was stretched through numerous federal agencies and executive departments. In other words, they knew a whole selection of code words that they seem to have included in this phone call. Finally, there's the Soviets, in this case Russia. It's called Namakan. It's a very shadowy group. You can't just call them up. But they speak from time to time. These are KGB old boys. And this appeared in the Russophile newspaper Zavtra in Moscow. And they say, yes, in effect, that's what it is. It's a group that is seeking confrontation. They have this nuclear launch capability, and they're interested in nuclear confrontation also with Russia, because you have to imagine that if it ever had come to this in the middle of 9/11, if missiles had ever gone up, as soon as missiles are launched, Russia and China and others see it, and they don't know where those missiles are going, because in the initial phase it's not clear what the target is. It takes a while to figure out where the missile is actually headed. It's important to remember that Russia was on a very high level of strategic alert on 9/11 because it had been carrying out strategic bomber maneuvers over the North Pole. Of course, the only conceivable target is Canada and the United States. And you can remember that if you read Richard Clarke's book on 9/11, he says that the State Department had to call the Soviets and ask them to call off their strategic bomber maneuvers, and essentially the Russians were asked not to go to a higher level of defense readiness, red alert, because the U.S. had raised the DEFCON to a sub-war level, but a very high level in response to the 9/11 attacks. So it's also important to remember that one of the main events of 9/11 that nobody writes about is the call between Putin and Bush. If you look at the big timeline that's just been published about 9/11, it seems to have absolutely no reference to this, which is really one of the huge developments on the day of 9/11, that Bush and Putin get on the phone, and it starts a kind of a honeymoon. I would call it a Hitler-Stalin pact disguised as a honeymoon. And Putin says, sure, send your forces into Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, all you want. Invade Afghanistan, all you want. Some have described it as a breathtaking turn by Putin vis-a-vis the United States. I think it's simply Putin saying, madmen are now ruling the United States. I will not get in their way now. I will let them disperse their forces across the world, make war against Afghanistan, make war against Iraq. They'll become weaker. I'll become stronger. I'm building missiles. I'm getting ready. This is not the time. I know they're crazy, but I'm putting on my smiley face as strategic deception. And I think that has become more and more clear as time has gone on. So this is probably another aspect of my book. I maybe haven't rendered the concept quite as clear as it might be, but it is complicated. I try to put 9/11 in the context of the world in which we live, and that is one in which the superpower tensions between the U.S. and Russia, the main nuclear powers in the world, are extremely strong. They were strong as a result of the bombing of Serbia in 1999. There was talk of the Third World War then, which the American media completely blacked out. And right now we're in a very, very kind of a new Cold War situation where that honeymoon seems to have pretty much ended. But I think the 9/11 events have got to also be seen within the context of the thermonuclear, the balance of terror in the world. And this is now real terror. This is the kind of thing that, you could have had thermonuclear exchange.
How do we know about the phone call between Putin and Bush?
That's extremely well documented. I mean, that's been written about in all kinds of academic journals, and that is, there were readouts by the Kremlin, readouts by the White House that there had been this wonderful, friendly telephone call between the two. And again, I quote some academics who read about this, saying that this was the most breathtaking pro-Western turn by any Russian leader in the entire history of the country, despite the fact that there was a very strong anti-U.S. feeling in Russia as a result of that bombing of Serbia. Putin did this. And again, I think he's saying, I'm playing for time. Bush will make the U.S. weaker. He'll attack other countries before he attacks me. I will become stronger. I will conserve my forces. And if Bush decides to attack me later on, and the neocons, they will be spread out across the world, and I will be more ready than they are. And again, the Hitler-Stalin pact, I don't want to try to make a one-to-one comparison between Bush and Hitler, although you can do that, and Putin and Stalin, but something of that nature is going on behind the scenes in this world. The tensions are much, much greater than you think, and 9/11 was a moment when they seemed to be disappearing, but really they were boiling behind the scenes.
I'm speaking with author and journalist Webster Tarpley. Today's show, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in the USA, Part 1. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Your chapter goes on to speak about Barksdale and Night Watch. What about that?
Well, what I'm trying to do here is to make some sense of the erratic movements of Bush across the country. So he takes off from the area of Sarasota, Florida. He then goes to Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, and then to Offwood Air Force Base, Nebraska. So what explained this? At the time, it attracted a great deal of criticism because Bush was accused of running like a rabbit, scurrying away, fleeing, and so forth. I tried to make sense of this with the help of those same three intelligence reports, the Réseau-Voltaire, the DEBCA, and the Namacon KGB Old Boys report. Réseau-Voltaire is very emphatic about this. According to Réseau-Voltaire, Bush is concerned, or the traveling party with him, and perhaps the traveling party back in the White House, is concerned that the coup group, which has carried out 9/11 now, and is demanding the war of civilizations, we must assume, might use the launch codes which they have indicated that they may well have to launch nuclear missiles and to begin the war of civilizations.